Meeting with connected forum.
I'm gonna, two things. You're welcome to fall asleep while I present this if you prefer, unlike Dennis, although I am hoping to leave some good time for discussion at the end. And because I did a qualitative study and I'm going to be using quite a few quotes from my students' work, I'm going to read, so this may not be quite as engaging as Dennis's. Hard to follow him always. But recently, several authors have begun to critique the ways that we often guide students to discern calling in our mostly white evangelical North American context. They've often raised in recent studies that those are not necessarily the ways that calling is discerned in other racial, ethnic, and cultural settings. Calls have been made to identify the challenges to pursuit of calling, particularly those which might be encountered by minority or underrepresented populations. And as a part of guiding students in our vocational discernment process, I think it's important for us to consider a broader approach as we guide our students, particularly given that the individuals that we are teaching come from around the world and are serving in this age of global migration that we're discussing this weekend, where they will then be serving individuals from around the world. In light of this, I designed a qualitative study to reflect on the potential benefits to including a wider range of perspectives on calling in courses related to ministry vocation discernment. Students in my undergraduate level Introduction to Christian Ministry course were assigned 4 readings in addition to their textbooks for the course. Each of the 4 readings was intended to reflect a perspective on Christian calling or vocation from beyond the typical perspectives of those students who are typically a member of my class. So I ordered the readings with an intention that they would grow in difficulty across the course of the semester. The first one was essentially a non-academic article, exposing them to the ideas of work theology, particularly from the perspective of the Global South. One of them was a chapter from Patrick Reyes's book that's an autobiography about his own experience in discerning his calling out of his personal realities in a gang-controlled neighborhood and an abusive family situation. And then the final 2 articles that I chose were peer-reviewed articles, one that focused on youth ministry because so many of my students are exploring youth ministry, and one that was about navigating pastoral calling in Côte d'Ivoire. Students were asked to respond to 4 questions as they read each of the articles. The first asked the student to consider how the author's context might shape how the author was approaching the topic of calling in their own article. So I asked the students to think about cultural, social, historical, or religious contexts. The second question and third question were really focused on asking students to reflect on similarities and differences between their own perspectives and those that the author was sharing in the article, and then to think about how that reading might have changed or challenged their own ideas or assumptions that they brought to the reading. And lastly, students were asked to consider how attention to perspective of the author shaped how they read the text. So, and thinking about whether or not they might use a similar approach in future readings that they encountered. I'll just tell you, not a part of this particular study I'm presenting today, but kind of as we talk about our calling, our classes on ministry calling as part of a broader coursework in our degree programs, part of my ulterior motive was that this is the first class in our program that most of our students take. They take Old and New Testament surveys, and then they take Intro to Christian Ministry. And so this is also the first time that they've begun to be introduced to the language of our discipline and to readings in our discipline. And so an ulterior motive was to get them ready for some of my colleagues' classes in reading the works in our discipline. So after the end of the semester, I analyzed the answers that students gave to the final 3 questions for themes and patterns that might emerge from the student responses. Students were assigned completion grades during the semester so that it wouldn't impact what they wrote and to protect any potential for them feeling compelled to write a particular way. I didn't read or see the responses to these until the end of the semester. 26 students in the class participated in some or all of the writing assignments. One student's work was eliminated from my analysis after I opened them because it was apparent there was use of an AI large language model for creation of the student's response. Yes. Not all students in the course, even though 26 students participated, not all students responded to all 4 readings or answered all 4 questions as a part of their responses. Students in the class included 13 women, 13 men. 2/3 were freshmen or sophomores by hours, but most of them were in their first year at the university. 5 students self-identified as Hispanic, 2 as African American, 19 as white. 23 of the 26 were either majoring within the College of Christian Studies or in church music. So after initial analysis, several themes emerged from student responses. First, how the students perceived vocation and calling. The idea of questioning where is God in the midst of either profound personal difficulty or searching for answers about where they were headed in their vocation was a place where students found common ground with the voices within the articles. A number of them found that they, even though the perspective or the circumstances were wildly different, that they found themselves in very much a similar searching kind of relationship with God as a part of their process. Almost half of students who responded to the first article found resonance with the theology of work that was articulated out of this perspective from the Global South. In particular, ideas that the role of work as a part of God's design for humankind, that there should be a rhythm of work and rest, and not finding your value or identity solely in your job, were all consistently listed as places of commonality between the students' perspectives and the articles that they read. I should probably note, however, that our university rewrote our first-year seminar curriculum to help students discern their purpose and calling beyond just getting a job 2 years ago, and these themes of a theology of work are woven within our first-year seminar curriculum. So I don't know that this would be true of a general freshman perspective. No other theme related to calling specifically was as strong in the data. Though a few other commonalities did arise, a number of them, the students referenced the more mystical or charismatic experiences like dreams or visions, which were a part of calling in some of the readings. With some students saying, that felt really familiar from my charismatic background, and some students saying, that was so strange, I've never heard of anything like that. And several made references to feeling some sort of reassurance about the breadth of the kind of people who were called in these articles, and feeling some comfort that God could call someone like me. In many cases, however, students entirely lost sight of the idea of calling or vocation that was described in the article, and instead got caught up in the particulars of the reality of the situation for the authors that were reading them. Almost half of the students included some sort of surface level or descriptive commentary about the social situation of the author when they talked about commonalities in perspective. I asked them to talk about how their perspectives were different, and they often got caught up in like, my situation was not the same. So the awareness of the situations, however, was often new, although few insisted, I've been on a mission trip, so I know all about this, ... The students did often describe a resulting increase in empathy that they felt for individuals with as they encountered these new experiences. So that was a really common theme in their responses. And with a number expressing a sincere desire to do something to address the kind of concerns and issues that they were exposed to as they read these articles. Sometimes with that like futility of like, what on earth could I possibly do as an 18-year-old in this situation? And some with a genuine like, I want to go fix this. Although often those were well-meaning, but perhaps ill-guided in their attempts. For instance, the student who wanted to, quote, take my youth camp and small group experience, unquote, and share it with those students in Africa. It's perhaps this desire for resolution or fixing the problem that resulted in the significant theme of these kind of pat theological answers or cliches that often showed up in the responses. Though they varied in content, they often reflected the kind of theological perspectives that we would generally caution against in pastoral care kind of conversations. So those might be comments like, quote, I would say that it does indeed confirm my belief that even in poor third world countries, the Lord's presence is still felt by people that are living there, end quote. Or, quote, whether we be in suffering or joy, we can find God's purpose for us through the things we have been through, end quote. I have a really hard time not reading those in a Mickey Mouse voice, by the way. In some cases, though admittedly very few, the pat theological responses described a confirmation bias where the confirmation came at the expense of the author's actual intent in the writing. For instance, one student wrote, quote, this confirmed my thought that God placed you in these trials so that you would learn to lean on him, end quote. Though it was clear as I read the article that the author did not actually come to that same conclusion. Several students then turned to sort of a sermonizing out of these theological insights that they had, or these cliches that they provided in response to the difficulties that they read about in the articles. Another theme that emerged was an insight that there might be more to ministry than I previously thought. Some of these included a recognition that, hey, churches might address social issues, not just spiritual ones. One student commented that a church addressing social concerns like joblessness or poverty was, quote, new to me. And another described the same article as having, quote, broadened my understanding that churches address more than spiritual concerns, end quote. A number of responses to the article on youth ministry reflected on the difference between their own youth ministry experiences and the one which they read about, which comments like this one, with comments like, this article, quote, challenged my earlier assumption that teaching correct beliefs was the main focus of ministry, end quote. Or the one who wrote that they had not previously realized that youth ministry might be, quote, more than just teaching basic biblical knowledge and organizing activities, end quote. As I read these responses, it might sound as though those students were minimizing their own youth ministry experiences, but I want to point out that to the contrary, these are students who loved their youth ministry experiences. Their perspectives on youth ministry were very positive, and they talked about those within their writings and certainly in our larger class context. But they were completely guided by their own experience, and even reading that someone might use a model or a framework to shape youth ministry was entirely new to most of them, with one writing, quote, I usually just relied on my personal experience. The final question asked students to respond to the process of reading with the social and cultural situation of the author in mind. In analysis of the responses to this question, several key themes emerged. Students recognized that paying attention to perspective made them less judgmental or more open-minded. One wrote, quote, I'm personally not very good at keeping an open mind. I like right and wrong. Paying attention to the perspective helped me gather that this was a topic I needed an open mind for, end quote. A couple of them described a process of becoming less judgmental of the author's perspective as they became more familiar with the social context. A number of students remarked that social context matters and influences theology or belief. This quote is reflective of this theme. Quote, it pushed me to consider how deeply social realities shape one's spiritual formation, end quote. Though this idea was not universally embraced, several students expressed a discomfort with an author's emphasis on racial or social reality, with one describing his reaction this way, quote, I disagree with his racial emphasis on everything. I think it's just unnecessary and blinds the text of the intended meaning. I am Hispanic as well, along with being raised in a Hispanic family and culture. but I wouldn't ever want my own race to make it into any of my writings due to its irrelevance on the subject. Some described their response with a bit of an in-between desire to really understand and be socially aware, but stick to the truth. With one describing that they were happy to better understand the idea of social context and how that might influence the ministry realities, but they also wanted to, quote, do lots of research and see what God tells me biblically to do. As with all qualitative data, these findings are not broadly generalizable. However, given the relative similarity in many of our student populations, I do think there might be a few early takeaways from this initiative that we might want to further discuss together, and I'm hoping to leave enough time for us to do that. First, as the faculty member, finding readings was hard, but worthwhile. A number of you got emails from me saying, what do you use? What do you have them read? And though beyond the scope of this paper as I've written it, I definitely became aware of the ways in which these structured reading assignments provided a scaffolding for students to read the literature of our disciplines. Many of my students really struggle with reading comprehension and deep reading, and I can speak a little more to it in our Q&A if there's interest, but I certainly did see students' development in their ability to read across the course of the 4 assignments, and then to really be able to take away the actual thesis or intention of the author by the end, as opposed to some of the earlier writings. Even though the articles were increasing in difficulty. One student wrote in the first article response, and a number of them said it to me verbally, though they didn't write it in their responses, this was so hard. It was just like a bunch of statistics. Okay, that was the one that was like a magazine article, by the way. Second, students need support in not only reading more deeply, but also in thinking theologically rather than just responding out of theological cliche. It's not a surprise to any of us in this room, but I did find myself noting how often some sort of pat answer showed up in the student responses, particularly when the content might have made them uncomfortable in some way. Students did not possess the skill set, nor the spiritual guidance, nor the language to manage the discomfort without moving toward resolution quickly. This was an introductory ministry course, so that's not surprising, but I think it's still worth noting. Third, grounding ideas of vocation and calling in a theology of work is a meaningful and productive exercise for our students. They had genuinely internalized those ideas quickly that were presented in their first year seminar in ways that prepared them to begin thinking more broadly about calling. In a globally connected world, and one in which our students often are from a wide variety of backgrounds, but will almost certainly minister to individuals from literally around the world, introducing them to a variety of perspectives on calling not only opens their minds, but also prepares them for guiding others to embrace their callings. And I'd love to just talk with you about what we might do with this, and any questions that you might have.
Emily's given us about 20 minutes, or 10 minutes for questions, and so if there are any questions that you have, please.
Well, you could speak a little bit more to the reading comprehension. So
Yeah.
I'm a first-year professor now.
Yes.
And that has definitely been one of my discoveries that I found quite frustrating
Yes.
as a professor, is the inability to comprehend what they're reading with a lot of my students.
Yeah, so for about 15 years, I have used an article at the end of my version of Intro to Christian Ministry at 2 different universities that you all may know. It's Simone Bai's Reflections on Right Use of Christian Studies, of studies, and after about 5 years in, I found that students couldn't even find her thesis anymore. Like, they struggled. They would be like, this is a great article about prayer. It's not an article about prayer, by the way, if you've never read it. And so, but I like to introduce it as a way of them thinking about, I'm about to have to take all these classes in ministry, and they're often like, I really just want to get out there and minister. I don't want to take theology. And so So we kind of use it as a launching pad into the rest of their studies. Well, this year, so my 4 readings, we read in class. That is a lot of class time to devote to the readings, I acknowledge. And I didn't anticipate they would actually read them with the level of attention I wanted them to give them if I assigned them as take-home readings. So I allotted 30-minute class period time slots for each of the readings where we sat and read them, and where I was available to support, like when they encountered a word they did not know or a concept that didn't make sense to them, and then where they wrote their reflections as we sat there. And like I said, groans and moans in that first article, which I thought was like the baby article of the 4. The second article I actually read aloud to them because I discovered they were so slow at reading that I didn't think they would make it through the article in the 30 minutes I had allotted. And so I read it aloud, and one student, it was abundantly clear, it's Patrick Reyes' book. I obviously said that at the beginning. The other 25 all figured that out. One of them, every time she wrote about it or he wrote about it, was like, she this and she that. And I thought, oh yeah, it's because I read it and they thought this was a woman that was writing it. But by the time we got to the end, so those first 2, it felt like a struggle. Like I watched them wrestle in class and be frustrated. By the last 2, though the readings were actually harder, they were peer-reviewed articles, I watched them gain confidence in like, oh, I know how to read this and how to respond and how to write. And by the time we got to Simone Weil's article, which I didn't include in the study because I've always used it and it's not about cultural issues, all but 2 in the room found her thesis and her main points. And that was huge to me because, 7 years ago, I literally had so many of them not find the point that my big joke became, that the ideas that they were getting out of this article were the same as saying that the thesis of Luke is that the pigs fell off the cliff. Because they would just like randomly pick a line out of the article and be like, this is what it's about. And so it really was, it was well worth, not just for my class, but I think for our program, as I look at my colleagues in the room who get them next, to think they have a little deeper critical reading skill than they did, but I think scaffolding it was really important for them to gain that success. Yeah.
Excellent.
Thanks for asking. I'm writing another study about that because I loved it so much.
Well, because I also teach preaching,
Yeah.
and I find it so difficult, and I spend so much time trying to help them discover the exegetical idea of the passage.
Yeah.
Because they do the same thing.
Same
They
thing.
grab a
They just
word or
pick a
grab
word.
something, and it's so difficult, yeah.
And I think like in a world where we Google for research, instead of like reading something and finding research ideas out of it, this is a pattern where they just they pick an idea or a sentence.
And you mentioned AI writing, but I think even in AI reading, right?
Yes.
I'm fascinated by this idea of doing it in class because, like, the paper may not be written by AI, but
Right.
they've had AI summarize a book or a chapter or whatever because any number of reasons.
Yes.
I'm fascinated by that. That's
Yes.
a great idea.
Yeah. I mean, it
We're
feels
just
like
going to read in class.
it feels like a massive commitment of our time, right? Like you think I'm losing all this time that I should be doing something else, and we moved so far to the flipped classroom where it's like anything they can do outside of class we should do, and then I've learned that what they can't do actually now is read. And to me it paid dividends to give up 2 hours of class time for us to learn to read together.
You personalized it.
Yeah.
That's a huge difference for professorial
Yeah.
influence on the
Yeah.
students.
So it was well worth it.
Speak to the theology of work. That
Yeah.
was my DMin project
Oh, excellent. Yeah.
from Gordon Conroe.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
So the first article really deeply talked about how when you're in a part of the world, was coming from a part of the world where even having a job was not necessarily a given. And I think for more and more of our students, that's also potentially a reality as they graduate and jobs are not as readily available for them. that finding many of our students have for years have thought, I'm going to find all of my worth in my job, and even in our ministry talk, we talk about it as if it becomes our identity. And so for them to think about, the article is really talking mostly about these are people who might be doing a really menial job. It might not be the thing that in general they would find deep meaning in, but they're finding ways to live out calling in spite of how they're making their income. And then beyond that, the struggle to have ministers when you can't afford to do that kind of work because you need to be doing other kinds of work. And so in our in our first year seminar, though, we have started talking about who are we designed to be and where do we find our identity, and then moving out of that space into, and how am I called to serve in the world? And then maybe I have a particular vocation, and maybe that vocation is tied to my job, but not necessarily equating job and vocation. And since the language in our culture is so frequently synonymous, helping students separate that. And I think that kind of helping them, we have a kind of a visual framework that helps them to separate those ideas and talk about purpose and meaning and identity and vocation not as synonymous. And they certainly found those ideas when they showed up in these articles and were able to identify them and say, oh, I recognize that. That feels familiar to me. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Thanks for asking.
Time for one more question.
Yeah, Steve.
Could you talk about, you had one of the students made a comment about discovering, I think it was something about jobs and just the difference between only spiritual work and then sort of this embodied work.
Yeah.
Was that a common theme, or was that something that you saw?
It was actually very common, particularly because in the third reading, which was about youth ministry in, I have to look, South Africa maybe? Yeah, South Africa. It was a lot of the conversation, it was about helping students to have hermeneutical agency and guiding them to have hermeneutical agency, and that being part of the task of youth ministry in that context, because they're addressing these huge social issues, and so their questions are not just who is Jesus, and what did Jesus do, and when did Jesus, go, and what is a parable? They're really grappling, even as teenagers, with these huge social and political issues. And so there was a pretty large theme around either youth ministry does more than just teach Bible verses, or youth ministry addresses social issues. Those were two huge themes that were in the responses coming out of that particular article, and mostly because their own experience was not that at all. That they were not a part of a congregation that had ever talked about the church's work in bringing the kingdom more broadly than saving a soul, and so that was a really foreign concept to them. They weren't against it or opposed to it, it just had never occurred to them that might be a question that the church would be answering elsewhere.
All right. Thank you.